We only have a couple more weeks together, so I thought it would be nice to give you another little pep talk, some optional encouragement that of course you're free to skip. None of this will be on the test. But if you'd like to be encouraged, I want to start by reminding you that you are doing fine in my class. No matter what your grade is right now, I want to encourage you that given the circumstances we're under, I'm going to make the material as approachable as possible and the tests as doable as possible. You don't have to worry that the tests are going to be hard or tricky. Everything is going to be fine. If you're having trouble, I'm here to help you. But I want to assure you that I'm doing my best to adjust my expectations of what you're going to accomplish in this class. I also want you to know that I care about you whether you do well in my class or not. However you do in this class, I hope to see you in future classes because you're all delightful and I care about each and every one of you. I don't want you to think that if you make a C or a D in this class, that means I wouldn't be delighted to see you again. I care about you personally regardless of your grades. I also want to encourage you that your other professors also care about you and will try to help you if you reach out to them. Not every professor is as open about their feelings and compassion for students as I am. I tend to wear my heart on my sleeve, but your other professors are doing this job for the same reason I am, which is that they care about you. So if you're having trouble in your other classes, level with your professors. Ask for what you need and give them the opportunity to show up for you. Finally, I want to remind you that you are more than your accomplishments. I've said this to you before, but I really want to reinforce it, which is no one who loves you right now will love you any less because of the grades you make, or any more for that matter. You are a big person. You are an entire human being who matters regardless of what you achieve. This is important to remember now because our usual markers of how well we're doing are not really available to us. We can't check in with classmates and faculty the same way we're used to. It's difficult to know exactly how well we're doing from moment to moment, and sometimes it feels like we're working in a void, with no one seeing what we do, and like what we do doesn't really matter. What you do does matter, but it's not the only thing about you or the most important thing about you. I'm sure you're doing just fine, but even if you're not, you're still a valuable person. And finally, I'd like to give you some unsolicited advice you didn't ask for. These are things that help me stay grounded and centered in times when maybe I'm feeling a little bit awash. Maybe I'm feeling a little bit like I don't know how I'm doing and I don't know what's important right now. Some things to try. You could call a loved one you haven't talked to in a while. This could be an elder relative, a sibling you don't talk to as much, a friend you haven't heard from in a few years. Remind yourself that you have connections with people besides the people most immediately around you. Remember that you matter to people in ways you don't often think about. Another thing you can try is to ask someone you trust what they love about you. Find someone you believe will tell you the truth, and someone you believe has your best interests at heart, and ask them to just tell you why you're important to them, why you matter in their lives. And what they're going to tell you is that you are a valuable person to them, that you make them feel good about themselves, that you make them want to be better people, things like that. They're absolutely not going to tell you that they love you because of your scholastic achievement or that they love you because you're such a diligent worker. They're going to tell you about your humor and your caring spirit and your generosity and your intelligence and your humor and all those other wonderful, stable things about you that are not affected by this epidemic at all. So this is my encouragement to you for this week. I hope it helps, and if it doesn't, feel free to ignore. I'll never know. First, I want to talk about race and ethnic inequality. And specifically, I want to talk about how historical racism and inequality have laid the foundations for the racial inequality that we see in the United States today. So, For each topic we talk about, I'm going to show kind of the historical roots of the problem and contemporary outcomes. So first, I want us to see what the situation looks like. This is what the racial wealth gap in the United States looks like today. I thought this was the best visualization, but the data are the same wherever you get them from. The racial wealth gap is huge. Whites have net worth that's 10% or more higher than African Americans or Latinos. And the wealth gap is not shrinking over time, really. It shrunk a little after the last recession. This is a forecast from about 2012 so the dotted lines represent forecasted wealth inequality. It's actually looking greater than this. That is, it's looking worse. So white wealth really rebounded more after the recession compared to Black and Latino wealth. But if you look at what happened to everyone's wealth during the last recession, white people dropped from about $161,000 to about $122,000. But Blacks and Latinos dropped from about $10,000 to about $1,000, meaning that, and this is the median household wealth. So this is the person, if we lined up all white people, this is the trend line for the person in the middle. And if we lined up all Black people and all Latino people, this is the wealth trend for the people in the middle. So this is the middle value. If we look at the mean, it would be even greater because you would have top earners skewing the distribution, meaning the mean wealth for white people is actually higher than this. The median is used to kind of control for the extremely wealthy. This is just the person in the middle. So this is the middle wealth gap, is a way to think of it. So we see that either way you look at it, white people own about 10 times more assets minus debt compared with Blacks and Latinos who own barely any. So this chart is based on Federal Reserve data from 2013. And it shows what happens to the wealth gap if you control for educational attainment. That is, how long someone went to school and what degrees they earned. So we often think that an explanation for the racial wealth gap is differences in educational attainment, but we can see here that that's just not true. For people with a high school degree, people who are white for people with less than high school, people who are white have about $50,000 of net worth, and people who are Black or Hispanic have $1,000 or less of net worth. The same is pretty much true for people with a high school diploma, except the gap widens a little bit, with white people approaching $100,000 and Black and Latino people still at less than $10,000 of net worth. Some college but no degree changes that a little. But we actually see that the gap is the widest for people with a college education, where white people approach $250,000 in net worth, or approach $300,000 in net worth. And Black and Latino people are still at well under $50,000, with Black people close to $20,000, and Latino people getting up closer to $50,000. So now I want to unpack some of the historical factors that cause the wealth inequality we see today. When we think about what we learned in the unit on wealth inequality, we learned that home ownership is the most important source of wealth for most Americans. Home ownership rates are much lower for people of color than they are for white people in the United States. And I want to talk about some of the reasons why. So if you look at this map, which you may recognize as a map of the city of Birmingham, um, you'll notice that it's drawn in pencil and looks a little crude. That's because it's from 1933. The legend on the side has a list of the colored blocks that you see and what each of them represent. So you see that the areas colored green are labeled best. The areas labeled blue are, quote, still desirable. The areas labeled yellow are definitely declining. The areas labeled red are hazardous. The areas that are solid gray have, quote, Negro concentrations. And the areas that are shaded gray with crosshatched are either commercial and industrial or undeveloped. So now I want us to look at this map and notice that the areas that are shaded gray, meaning that they have a high concentration of black people living in them, are surrounded in large part by areas that are red, meaning hazardous. So we see that the areas where black people lived in 1933 were surrounded by areas that were industrial and commercial and were either hazardous or, quote, definitely declining. And if we look at this area, we might recognize a lot of the neighborhoods. So you can actually see kind of the over the mountain districts in green down to the south. And then up in the north, you can see neighborhoods like North Birmingham, where we now know there's a Superfund site, areas around the Sloss furnaces, areas around Norwood and railroads that are considered undesirable and have high degrees of high concentrations of black people living there. And if you look out to the west, you can actually see the area around Birmingham Southern College is shaded blue, meaning it's still desirable. And it's adjacent to the neighborhood of Inslee, which is shaded gray and surrounded by red. The map we just looked at is exactly the kind of map that banks used to enact a practice called redlining. Redlining literally refers to the lines on the map delineating neighborhoods where they would not make loans. Banks refused to make loans or charged exorbitant interest rates on loans to people in predominantly black neighborhoods. This is an example of a race-neutral policy on the face of it, because they could simply say that these areas were underdeveloped, undesirable, and didn't make a good investment for the bank. Nonetheless, it was used to discriminate against black people who were not able to get loans to buy homes in black neighborhoods. This especially affected black veterans after World War II. After World War II, rates of home ownership surged as veterans were given special lending programs through the GI Bill and were able to buy homes in record numbers. But black veterans were not able to take advantage of these programmings because of redlining. Anywhere they could buy a house, they couldn't get a loan to buy a house. Black families were not welcome in white neighborhoods. So what white landlords would do is buy up properties in predominantly black neighborhoods because they didn't need to get a loan. They were often wealthy enough to self-fund the purchase of a house without getting a mortgage on it. So they would buy a house outright and then rent it to black families in that neighborhood. And they could charge pretty much whatever rent they wanted to and still retain ownership of the property. So redlining not only deprived black Americans of the ability to own a home, it also directly enriched white families because they could buy property in black neighborhoods, rent it to black families, keep the rent and then keep the property. So if the neighborhood turned around, they then owned property there. If you click on the link below, you see a contemporary map of Birmingham, and you can still see the same neighborhoods that are outlined on the map in the previous slide as being undesirable, hazardous, the best neighborhoods, etc., look very much like they did in 1933. We can easily recognize distressed neighborhoods as the predominantly black neighborhoods on the map from 1933. And we can easily recognize the best neighborhoods and most desirable neighborhoods as the neighborhoods that were desirable in 1933. So we can easily see how redlining laid the foundations for the kinds of inequality we see in housing today. As a result of programs like redlining, this is the level of inequality we see in home ownership rates in the United States today. This is data taken from the 2019 census in the last quarter of the year. So this is the most recent data that we have as a nation. And what we see is that 73.7% of white families own the home they live in, compared with 44% of black people, 48% of Hispanic people, and 57% of Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and 55% of people who identify as other. So this would encompass people who are Asian, people who are Indigenous American, and people who identify as another race. Referring back to slide 5, we know that education doesn't do anything to diminish the wealth gap between black people and white people in the United States. However, it does lead to more earnings for black people. That is, people of all races with a college degree earn more than people without a college degree, and people with a high school degree earn more than people without a high school degree, regardless of race. White people will still out-earn people of color in every category, but we still think that access to education is an important building block for future equality. This map shows the history of segregation in schools prior to Brown versus Board of Education, which took place in 1954. So it's important to realize that schools were not automatically integrated after the ruling in 1964. In fact, most school districts weren't forced to integrate on a larger scale until the 1970s. So here we see states shaded in red required racial segregation in schools prior to the 1954 ruling, which made it unconstitutional. Orange shaded states allowed segregation, made it optional for the school district. State shaded blue had no legislation requiring or prohibiting segregation. And state shaded green forbade segregation based on race in public schools prior to 1954. So although school segregation by race was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1954, most schools didn't actually integrate at that time. That is, they were required to admit black students who wanted to go to white schools, but they didn't actually take measures to require schools to admit similar numbers of black and white students or proportional numbers of black and white students. That was done in the 1960s and 70s in the form of busing. Busing is when students were actually taken from black schools and bused to white schools, and sometimes the reverse also happened. Though in most school districts, the black school was simply shut down and the white school was expanded to include black students. This meant that many black educators and administrators lost their jobs because the white schools were not required to hire them. Or they were required, in some systems, there was a quota for how many black educators had to be hired, usually around 20 to 25%, but there were no laws requiring that those educators then be retained. So in many districts, the black educators were hired and then immediately fired, often within the same month. Um, so these schools basically required black students to go to all white schools. Um, but even that wasn't done until the 1960s, 1970s in some cases. And this practice of busing was continued until the 1980s when it was discontinued. After busing ended in the 1980s, levels of segregation returned and in some cases surpassed pre-busing levels. So in some districts throughout the South, um, inequality in school segregation is actually higher than it was between the Brown versus Board of Education ruling and the implementation of busing. Um, so if you look at this map, you see that the areas with the highest concentrations of inequality are actually the areas where segregation was required prior to 1954. The areas of medium blue are distributed where segregation was either optional or there was no legislation. And the lighter blue areas where there's low inequality um, are largely in areas where segregation was forbidden. The exception is Texas and parts of the Southwest, where there are fairly low pockets of segregation, um, even though those were areas where segregation was allowed. If you look at the Southeast and up the eastern seaboard, you see high areas of inequality. One reason why we think that school segregation is bad is that when students are segregated by race, it's really easy for school districts to allocate more resources to schools that are designated for white students. The same thing can happen when a school is segregated in fact, even if not by law. Schools can become sites of massive inequality, with predominantly white schools being located in neighborhoods that receive a lot of property tax funding and a lot of sales tax funding, and therefore a lot of school funding, and black students not having access to those public schools. And one reason we think this is important is for educational attainment. Students who go to better schools beginning in preschool have better educational attainment than students who go to worse public schools. This sounds like a no-brainer, but I want to make sure we're making the connection between school segregation and inequality in college attainment. So this chart shows the proportion of students who enroll in college who complete within 6 years. And for white Americans who entered college in 2010, 64% complete college within 6 years at the first institution they enrolled in. So this doesn't count transfer students. 45% of white students complete within 4 years, an additional 15 within 5 years, and an additional 4% in the 6th year. For black students, 21% complete within 4 years, an additional 14% within 5 years, and an additional 5% within 6 years, totaling 40%. So about a third more students, or about a third more white students than black students, complete college within 6 years. And this hurts long-time earning outcomes. Now I want to tell you a story about a study that accidentally demonstrated the degree to which race is still a determining factor in hiring decisions. So you may think to yourself that perceptions of racial discrimination in hiring are very difficult to prove because you can never prove that it's race and not some other factor. A sociologist named Diva Pager in 2003 for her master's thesis wanted to prove that having a criminal record would affect black people more than white people in hiring decisions. In other words, she wanted to prove that among people with a criminal record, white people would get more job callbacks than black people. Um, in order to do this, she designed a vignette study. A vignette study is when we present subjects with with a biographical sketch of a person that's fictitious. So we make up a person and we give them like a profile, and then we give a description of that person that's made up to someone in an experiment. Diva Pager went way beyond creating fake resumes for her imaginary job applicants. She actually hired actors and trained them to represent her vignettes. So she created identical resumes for black and white job applicants, including whether or not that person had ever been convicted of a crime. She then hired matched pairs of black and white actors to portray these applicants in phone calls and interviews. She trained them carefully to behave in similar ways, to answer questions exactly alike, to dress similarly, etc. And then she had them respond to wanted ads for jobs and accept requests for interviews. And then she measured how many people in each category, that is, black with a criminal record, black with no criminal record, white with a criminal record, and white with no criminal record, got callbacks for the job. And this chart shows the results. Now, what Diva Pager expected to find that was that white people would get called back more often if they had a criminal record than black people if they had a criminal record. And she certainly did find that. If you look at the bars on the left, you see that the orange bar shows that 17% of white applicants with a criminal record got calls back, compared with 5% of black people with a criminal record. What she didn't expect to find was what's shown in the bars on the right. She expected, of course, that among people without a criminal record, black people would get called back less anyway. What she didn't expect was that they would be called back only half as often, or less than half as often, 14% of the time versus 34%, and that in fact, white people with a criminal record would be called back more often than black people with no criminal record. So while she set out to show that the mark of a criminal record would impact black people more seriously than white people, she didn't expect to find that white people with a criminal record would still do better than black people with no criminal record in hiring situations simply because of race. But that's what she found, and she's successfully replicated her results. So this chart, using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2000 and 2017, shows unemployment rate differences for black people and white people. So we see that in 2000, white people with less than a high school diploma had about a 5% unemployment rate, and that it was about 7% or 6% in 2017. In the same time period for black people, unemployment with less than a high school diploma was at about 10%, so twice as high in 2000, and more than twice as high in 2017 at about 15%. So the gap is widening more for black people, but at every level of education, the rate is about twice as high for black people as for white people. And this is controlling, remember, for level of education. So educational attainment does not explain these differences. So while we may think that hiring discrimination is difficult to prove, the Diva Pager study shows that it is still happening, and we see evidence of it in this unexplained gap in unemployment rates. Now that we've talked about differences by race, I want to talk about differences by gender. And I want to be really clear. These are not mutually exclusive categories. In other words, some people who are people of color are also women. So while I'm not going to focus on intersectional differences, that is, differences between black women and white women, or differences between black men and white men, or black men and white women, it's important to realize that those differences exist. People can be disadvantaged on axes of race and gender, and people can be advantaged on one axis and disadvantaged on the other. So it's never as simple as it looks when we break things out by race or gender. So just keep that in mind. So this is what the gender pay gap looks like. And this study, done by Glassdoor Economic Research, which is obviously a for-profit institution, so you should take this with a grain of salt. But this visualization breaks down the gender pay gap by different potential causes. So if you look, the gender pay gap in 2019 was 21.4%, meaning for every dollar that a man made, a woman made about 78 cents. If you look at the same green bar, when we control for age, education, and years of experience, you see that it's reduced to 19%. When you add controls for industry, occupation, state, year, and firm size that the person works at, it goes down to 7.6%. And when you add things like company-specific controls and job title-specific controls, the gap goes down to only 4.9%. Now, where does that 4.9% pay gap come from? So basically, once you control for all of these factors, women are making about 95 cents on the dollar, which is pretty close to parity. We can imagine that those 5 cents are explained by pure discrimination or differences in ability or other things. But we're not sure. By ability here, I mean physical ability to work, not ability at their jobs. So we can imagine that this 4.9% could be explained by any number of things. We're not sure. But what we do know is that women are socialized into certain occupations that men are not. So when I told people when I was a child that I wanted to be a doctor, I was asked why I didn't want to be a nurse. When I told people that I wanted to be a pastor of a church, it was suggested to me that I could be a choir director. But even before I had any idea what I wanted to be, the messages I was sent by society were that certain jobs were more suited for women than for men. And those were the ways that I was socialized by society. And all of you are too. So while socialization into certain occupations is changing, so that women are being socialized to take on more male-dominated professions, the opposite is not true. That is, men are not being encouraged to work in female-dominated professions, and so women are still often being pressured to accept those jobs. So just because these factors explain the gender pay gap doesn't mean that discrimination and gender socialization isn't taking place at every step of the way. Another potential explanation for the gendered pay gap is that women choose to take on fewer responsibilities at work because they're taking on more responsibilities for home and family. And this infographic using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics demonstrates that women are spending about an hour more a day on housework compared with men. They're preparing food and drink. They're doing interior cleaning, laundry, household management, other household chores, kitchen and food cleanup. The only chores where men outwork women are lawn and garden and house plants and maintenance and repair. So women are spending about an hour more a day on housework than men are. What's not measured in this is the time spent planning these activities. So for food and drink prep, I may spend 37 minutes a day actually preparing dinner. But I also have to have the mental space to plan a menu, to make a shopping list, and the time to go to the grocery store, and to think about the nutrition in the food I'm preparing. So these tasks quickly eat up more time than is measured by the time I simply spend doing the tasks. And this body of work that women take on is called the second shift. While there are many partial explanations for the gender pay gap, the biggest, most straightforward, and most demonstrable explanation is children. So if you look at these charts, focusing on the one on the right-hand panel in the top row, which illustrates the United States, the green line at the top represents men's earnings. The blue line at the bottom represents women's earnings. The y-axis at the right of this chart represents change in earnings in thousands of dollars per year. So at the red baseline is at 0. This is the baseline earnings that a person has before they have a child. And if you look up, it goes up to $20,000 above what they were earning before they had a child, and down to $100,000 more, or $100,000 less than they were earning when they had before they had their first child. The gray line, which is set to 0 on the y-axis, or on the x-axis, represents the birth of a person's first child. So if you look right up 5 years before the birth of the first child, right up to 1 year before the birth of the first child, right around where pregnancy would start, you see that men's and women's earnings are at a parity. That is, men and women in the United States earn about the same amount until pregnancy with the first child begins, at which point women's earnings drop off sharply by about $40,000 a year, and they never recover. Even 10 years out from having your first child, when the child has been in school for years, your earnings have not recovered. So notice that this doesn't happen to men. Men experience something of a fatherhood penalty. Men tend to earn about $1,000 less at work per year after they have a child than before. But this isn't true in all countries. In some countries, like Britain, men go up a little bit. Same in Sweden. In Austria and Germany, men's earnings at year 10 are pretty much flat where they were. Men's earnings remain pretty stable, while women's take a nosedive and never fully recover. In some countries, the earning deficit is much worse. So in Germany, it's 60,000. It goes down to 80,000 right after childbirth, and recovers back up to 60,000 less than they were earning before they had a baby. So we see that women simply earn much less money after they have a baby, whereas before women have babies, the wage gap is virtually non-existent. This chart by Pew Research illustrates a little bit about the motherhood penalty. So these are choices that people might make to accommodate the responsibility of childcare. This also includes care for other family members, such as a sick partner or an elder parent who may need care. And it shows what percentage of mothers and fathers say they've done the following things to accommodate care for a child or family member. 28% of fathers and 42% of mothers say they've taken reduced hours at work. 24% of fathers and 39% of mothers say that they've taken a significant amount of time off. 10% of fathers and 27% of mothers say that they have quit a job. And 13% of mothers and 10% of fathers say that they have turned down a promotion in order to care for children of any age, including adult children.